The North Tower collapses in a curtain of fire and glass, a thunder that throws pigeons like torn pages and turns the river into a mirror of smoke while people below scatter and scream. The world, for a single breath, becomes nothing but heat and falling things. In the middle of that catastrophe, a man with a white collar stands on a fractured overpass, as if the concrete itself respects him, and when he moves the motion is not hurry but certainty. Satoru Gojo steps forward through the chaos with a calm that looks almost bored, and the noise of weapons and orders around him recedes like a bad radio. He is there because the state put his name on a black folder, and because armored men with better intentions than courage insisted someone unbreakable be a public instrument. And yet he does not lower his head to any banner. His presence reads like a promise and a problem at once. Glass still rings in the air as he lifts a single hand, and the catastrophe folds around an invisible edge, and the crowd thinks the worst has passed until something farther up the skyline flares colder and brighter. And this is only the beginning. Far worse is coming. You're watching this for a reason, and if you want to keep listening, subscribe once now, not as flattery but as a warning, because what starts here will not stay contained and the consequences will be shoved into every headline you think you can ignore. Stay close. This story gets darker. The directive did not arrive as a speech or a ceremony, but as a legal instrument wrapped in the language of necessity, because by the time the federal brief crossed the last desk, the footage had already leaked, and the public had already chosen sides about a fight that hadn't technically started yet. It named Satoru Gojo as a federal regulator of superhuman activity under Emergency Stabilization Authority, which meant in practice that a man who did not believe in institutional gravity had just been assigned to operate inside it, and the agencies tasked with coordinating him were already arguing about jurisdiction before his transport had cleared the runway. The stated objective was compliance through presence rather than force, a phrase that would look clean in hearings later, but the unstated reality was that they wanted an untouchable to stand between cities and the consequences of corporate heroism without making it look like a coup. Gojo read the assignment once, upside down, and asked if there would be snacks at the press conference, which is how the first staffer understood that whatever this arrangement was, it would not be obedience. His arrival in New York was deliberately quiet because someone believed that if you avoided spectacle, you could avoid provoking it. And yet the skyline had a way of making every landing a performance, whether you wanted it or not. A temporary federal liaison team met him in a service corridor beneath a municipal building, where the paint smelled new enough to suggest panic funding, and they explained the legal thresholds for intervention, as if reciting weather advisories to a storm that had already decided where to go. Gojo listened with his hands in his pockets and asked which part of "protect civilians" required a memo. And when they tried to answer in terms of liability, he nodded in a way that meant he had stopped taking the conversation seriously 3 sentences ago. The rules were clear enough on paper. Observe, de-escalate, compel compliance where appropriate, and avoid visible brutality that could trigger market instability. A list that read less like a mission than a public relations strategy with emergency powers stapled on top. Across the river, Vought's morning segment pivoted from a charity ribbon-cutting to an urgent banner about federal overreach, because by then the rumor had crystallized into a name, and the name into a face that was not on any of their payrolls. Ashley Barrett called a meeting that began with legal disclaimers and ended with the phrase, "state-backed replacement," spoken in a voice that made everyone sit up. And within minutes, a talking point was circulating about unauthorized interference in privately contracted hero operations. The internal message was that optics would decide this fight before physics ever got a chance, and the external message was that the government was attempting to nationalize safety by threatening the people who provided it. Somewhere between those two scripts, a red dot blinked on a map over Midtown, and the segment cut to live footage of a Supe apprehension gone wrong. The incident had started as a sponsored arrest with 3 camera angles and a smiling bystander package. But the suspect had not agreed to the choreography, and the first blast took out a bus stop that had not signed a release form. By the time the responding team realized their containment foam would not hold against heat that looked like melted daylight, the block had already filled with civilians who were trying to leave through each other, and the second blast turned a storefront into a gust that moved people whether they wanted to move or not. The liaison's phone lit up with an authorization request that was technically redundant because the statute had anticipated urgency, but the habit of asking permission dies slowly in rooms with flags. Gojo did not wait for the verbal confirmation that came half a second later. He was already walking toward the sound. He stepped into the open where the cameras could see him, which was not part of the plan but had a way of becoming it. And the first thing the crowd noticed was not the blindfold or the height, but the fact that nothing seemed to touch him the way it touched everything else. The air around him behaved like it had found a boundary it could not cross, and fragments that should have drawn blood instead slid away as if embarrassed by the attempt, while the Supe responsible for the blasts pivoted toward the new variable with a grin that belonged on a cereal box and nowhere near a disaster. The man threw heat with the confidence of someone who had never been told no by matter, and the street answered with another collapsing window and a bloom of warped steel that reached for Gojo's face and stopped an inch short like a thought that could not finish itself. Somewhere above, a hovering camera caught the moment the invisible line between contact and consequence refused to exist, and the live feed went from commentary to silence as the blast folded around a man who did not flinch. Gojo raised a hand in a gesture that was almost casual, and the space between them tightened with a pressure that did not look like anything until it started pulling the asphalt into a shallow bow toward his palm. He did not explain blue to anyone because explanations would have wasted the second he needed, and when the Supe tried to step forward, the step became a stumble as the world insisted on being somewhere else first. The force that followed was not theatrical but precise, a correction that lifted the attacker off his feet and set him down against a fire hydrant hard enough to dent it without turning the man into a headline the government could not spin. On the perimeter, Huey Campbell watched through a line of police tape that had not decided whether it was meant to hold people back or keep something worse in, and he did not recognize the technique, but recognized the difference between performance and intervention immediately. Billy Butcher, standing 2 bodies over with a look that suggested he trusted neither the state nor the sky, muttered that this one didn't smell like Compound V, and that made him more dangerous than any brand ambassador in a cape. Mother's Milk kept his eyes on the civilians because the crowd crush was now the bigger risk, and the way the new arrival moved through it without touching anyone did not fit the pattern they had learned to expect from power. By the time the authorized response team reached the center of the block, the attacker was conscious and unable to move. The fires had found edges they could not cross, and the cameras had a new angle that made the federal seal in the background look less like reassurance and more like a wager. The liaison's earpiece filled with overlapping questions about custody, jurisdiction, and whether the optics of restraint were preferable to the optics of victory, while a Vought representative on another channel began drafting a statement about unauthorized interference with contracted heroes. Gojo glanced at the man pinned against municipal infrastructure and asked if he was done, and when the answer arrived as another attempt to ignite the air, he sighed in a way that suggested paperwork was about to become his least favorite weapon. The first siren of a second incident began to climb somewhere downtown before the cuffs had even clicked, and the map on the liaison's tablet updated with a cluster that did not look accidental. In a penthouse that did not show on any public registry, Homelander watched the same live feed on a muted wall and leaned closer to the glass, not because he needed to, but because he wanted to see if the man on the street was looking back. The third blast never came, but the fourth alert did, and it wasn't for Midtown. By the time the second alert resolved into coordinates, the argument had already started about whether Gojo's presence should be announced before he arrived, because someone in the communications office believed transparency would stabilize markets, while someone in legal believed advance notice would expose the state to liability if anything went visibly wrong. The debate moved faster than policy usually did, because the Midtown footage had converted skepticism into attention, and attention into a pressure that no department wanted to own when it became consequences. Gojo listened to the discussion through a speaker that was technically meant for him, and asked whether the civilians at the next site would be safer if he waited for a press strategy, and the silence that followed was permission disguised as process. The authorization came as a phrase about imminent harm that would read very well in a report later, and he stepped out into a street that was already learning how to pronounce his assignment. Downtown had not been built for containment, which meant the responding hero team had chosen spectacle as a substitute, and the attempt to hold a volatile Supe in a plaza had drawn a ring of phones that became a second hazard as soon as the shouting started. Starlight was there because Vought had insisted on a recognizable face to anchor the scene, and her instructions were to de-escalate in a way that left room for brand partnerships afterward, which would have been easier if the man in front of her had not been turning decorative lighting into a weapon with every pulse of his hands. The plaza's fixtures brightened past design tolerance, and then failed in a cascade that showered glass onto a crowd that did not know where to run, and the responding team's foam rounds dissolved before they could make a promise. When Gojo arrived, the first thing she noticed was not the blindfold, but the way the air between him and the falling shards refused to finish the journey. He did not introduce himself because introductions would have implied he was there to negotiate, and instead he asked Starlight if she could keep the exits clear while he handled the part of the problem that did not respect contracts. The Supe in the center laughed at the suggestion that anyone without a cape could regulate him, and the next surge of light tried to turn the distance between them into a corridor of heat that ended where Gojo stood and stopped, as if it had encountered a law it did not understand. Infinity was not a spectacle to the crowd because it left nothing to see except failure, and the second surge died the same quiet death as the first while the plaza's remaining bulbs dimmed in protest. Somewhere above the awning line, a drone captured the attacker's confusion as the world refused to agree with his power, and the live commentary shifted from play-by-play to questions about federal authority. Inside Vought Tower, Ashley's team had already reframed the Midtown incident as a one-off collaboration, while the legal department drafted language about state interference with proprietary response protocols, and the downtown live feed forced them to move from hypotheticals to posture. The new talking point described Gojo's presence as an intimidation tactic that risked civilian panic, which would have been more persuasive if the civilians on the ground were not moving toward him rather than away. A compliance officer suggested requesting an injunction based on jurisdictional ambiguity, and the room agreed because courts were slower than disasters and time favored anyone who could afford the wait. The ticker at the bottom of the screen began to crawl with a question about whether the government had the right to regulate heroes, and the question was already a victory for someone. In the plaza, Gojo raised 2 fingers, and the space around the attacker bent in a way that did not leave marks on anything that could sue, and the pull of blue took hold with a precision that folded the man's footing out from under him without folding the man himself. The ground groaned as if it had been asked to remember a shape it no longer preferred, and the attacker's attempt to discharge another pulse turned into a shudder that found no purchase. Starlight saw the moment his confidence broke not because of pain, but because the rules had changed, and she realized with a clarity that felt like betrayal that this was not a team-up but an audit. When the Federal Response Unit moved in with restraints that had passed procurement rather than marketing, the applause that started at the edges of the crowd sounded less like relief and more like a vote. Huey and Butcher watched from a cafe that had become a command post for anyone willing to pretend coffee was strategy. And the way the second scene resolved without collateral shifted the question they had been asking since Midtown. Mother's Milk pointed out that a man who could stop blasts without branding would ruin the entire business model, and Frenchie wondered aloud what a government would do with a tool it could not threaten. Butcher's answer was that they would try anyway, and the attempt would be the story worth following. The feed cut briefly to a split screen that showed Homelander landing at a charity hospital, smiling with a patience that did not reach his eyes. At the Federal Coordination Center, a senator's aide asked whether Gojo would submit to oversight reviews, and the liaison replied that he had agreed to briefings, which was not the same thing as submission, but might satisfy the letter of the question. The distinction mattered because the third alert had just appeared on the map in a borough that did not trend well, and the pattern suggested provocation rather than coincidence. A request from Vought's counsel arrived within the minute asking for clarification on operational boundaries, and the phrasing implied a lawsuit that had already decided its venue. Gojo looked at the tablet, then at the street, and asked if anyone would prefer he waited for permission this time. Across the city, a siren changed pitch in a way that meant the next problem would not fit inside a plaza, and the news chyron updated from downtown to borough-wide disturbance as a familiar red-white-blue streak crossed the skyline toward it. The legal lines had been drawn in conference rooms, but the next one would be drawn where cameras could not turn away. By mid-afternoon, the legal framework that had seemed theoretical at breakfast began to act like weather, because Vought's counsel filed for an emergency injunction that would not stop Gojo from moving, but would make every movement an argument about authority. The filing described federal intervention as a destabilizing force that risked civilian safety through unvetted methods, and it asked the court to define the difference between regulation and replacement before the market decided on its own. Inside the coordination center, someone tried to explain that compliance would require Gojo to notify corporate responders before engaging any contracted supe, and the room understood that the rule had been written to slow him down rather than make anyone safer. Gojo listened to the summary and asked whether the next emergency would wait for a conference call, and when no one volunteered the promise, he stepped away from the table as if leaving a restaurant that had run out of food. The borough-wide disturbance was not a single incident, but a cluster that looked organized once you stopped pretending it was coincidence, because 3 separate altercations began within minutes of each other in neighborhoods that shared nothing except camera coverage. A transport truck carrying promotional materials for a hero event had been overturned in Queens by a supe whose powers had never tested well in rehearsals, and the responding team was still trying to decide whether to prioritize containment or optics when the first storefront caught fire. In Brooklyn, a sponsored patrol went loud after a bystander confrontation escalated into a live broadcast of community engagement that turned into a standoff with a man who could liquefy pavement in strips. In the Bronx, a training exercise became a rescue that became a liability as a junior hero misjudged a landing and brought a scaffold down onto a line of commuters who had not signed up to be saved. Vought's media division moved with a speed that suggested rehearsal, because within minutes the narrative had shifted from chaos to coordination failure attributed to federal interference, and the question on every panel became whether Gojo's presence was provoking incidents by undermining hero confidence. Starlight found herself on a split screen being asked whether oversight from an external regulator made her team hesitate, and she chose her words carefully because anything else would become a clip before she reached the end of the sentence. The internal directive from Ashley was to emphasize partnership while litigating independence, a contradiction that worked as long as the footage could be framed to support it. A producer suggested cutting to Midtown again for comparison, and the legal department said no because the comparison would not help. At the first sight, Gojo arrived to find a responder arguing with a brand manager about the visibility of restraints, and the delay had allowed the pavement liquefying soup to carve a channel toward an apartment entrance that was now full of people trying to decide if staying still counted as safety. Infinity did what it always did without announcing itself, and the first wave that tried to swallow the sidewalk met a boundary that made the surface bulge rather than break where he stood. He asked the junior hero to move the civilians toward the fire stairs, and when the hero hesitated because the stairs were not in frame, Gojo pointed without looking and the hesitation ended. The correction he applied this time was gentler because the building would have to stand tomorrow, and Blue drew the attacker back from the doorway in a slow, inexorable glide that left the tile intact and the cameras confused. In Queens, Starlight redirected traffic with a voice that had learned how to sound calm in advertisements, and she watched the second scene on a feed that lagged by seconds, but told the same story about priorities. The federal unit's arrival did not include a sponsor banner, and the cuffs they carried were not designed for a reveal, which meant the resolution would not be monetized in the same way. A bystander asked whether the government would pay for the damages, and the question found a microphone before it found an answer. Somewhere above the rooftops, a red-white-blue figure changed course mid-flight, as if reconsidering an appointment. Inside Vought Tower, the countermeasure moved from narrative to operation when a memo authorized select heroes to continue engagements without notifying federal regulators in the interest of public safety, and the phrase would be defended later as necessary autonomy. The intent was simpler: establish facts on the ground faster than the state could define them, and force Gojo into a pattern of reacting rather than initiating. Ashley approved the distribution with a hand that shook just enough to notice, because the third site had gone live, and the training exercise's collapse was now a rescue that would not photograph well. The room began to discuss liability again, and the word replacement returned with less irony than before. Gojo reached the scaffold in time to stop the second fall rather than the first, and the steel that should have crushed a row of commuters found the same invisible refusal that had turned blasts aside earlier in the day. He did not look up when the shadow passed over him because the change in wind announced the arrival before the landing did, and Homelander's boots touched down with a sound calibrated for attention. The smile he offered was perfect for a hospital corridor and wrong for a construction site, and his first question was whether federal regulators now handled rescues too. Gojo replied that he handled civilians, and the distinction landed harder than any accusation. The injunction hearing would begin in less than an hour, but the cameras were already here, and the legal lines had moved from paper to pavement, as two different authorities stood over the same disaster with two different definitions of help. The commuters were still pinned beneath the first fall when the second siren changed pitch again, and this time it was for something headed their way. The hearing began without waiting for the day to settle because the market would not pause for testimony, and a federal attorney tried to argue that oversight was not substitution, while a corporate counsel suggested that regulation without consent was indistinguishable from seizure. In a different part of the city, where language did not matter unless it moved concrete, two men stood over the same wreckage with a line of civilians between them and the clock already deciding who would be blamed for the next mistake. Homelander's presence pulled every lens in a 10-block radius toward the scaffold, and the rescue that should have been a coordination problem became a referendum about legitimacy as soon as he offered to take over. Gojo watched the commuters breathing rather than the cameras, and when Homelander reached for the first beam with a flourish designed for reassurance, the steel groaned in a way that suggested the wrong angle could finish what gravity had started. He asked Homelander to wait, not because he believed in permission, but because the building did, and the request landed as an insult wrapped in procedure. The smile that followed was still perfect, but it had learned a new tension at the corners, and the promise to be careful sounded like a dare in a place that had run out of patience for theater. Infinity did its work quietly as Gojo stepped into the collapse zone, turning dust and splinters into a problem for someone else while he shifted the first load with a precision that did not photograph well. The commuters felt the change before they saw it, because the pressure on their legs eased without the snap of something breaking, and the gap that opened was just wide enough to pull the nearest woman free without inviting a second fall. Across the street, a producer whispered that this was the shot, because a federal regulator and the country's most marketable hero were now sharing a frame in a way that would define the evening. Starlight moved to help with the triage, and the way Gojo directed traffic without looking at a single camera made the choreography feel less like a show and more like an evacuation. Homelander lifted the second beam with a strength that would have drawn applause on any other day, but the applause that came was thinner because the comparison had already begun. The difference was not in force but in aftermath, and the lack of collateral had a way of turning competence into a critique. Downtown, the third cluster bloomed into a fire that did not care about brands, because the overturned transport had begun to burn in a way that suggested the cargo was less benign than the manifest claimed. A responding hero attempted to vent the flames upward, and found that the heat followed the channel into a residential window, and the bystander footage turned a mistake into a headline before anyone could correct it. The federal unit's request for Gojo was denied by someone who wanted him to remain visible beside Homelander, which meant the city would have to wait for the part of help that did not smile. The liaison relayed the order with an apology that sounded like a forecast. In Queens, Starlight's team tried to hold a perimeter that shrank with every minute the fire climbed, and the junior hero from earlier asked whether the government's regulator could intervene off-site without violating the injunction that had not yet been granted. The question did not matter to the Flames, but it mattered to the insurance adjusters who would arrive later, and the delay began to look like policy rather than prudence. Butcher watched the split feeds from a van that had stopped pretending to be inconspicuous, and he noted that the state had finally found a way to make inaction look responsible. Mother's Milk pointed out that people were still inside the building, and the observation did not improve anyone's mood. Back at the scaffold, the last commuter was nearly free when the fourth alert cut through the chatter with a tone reserved for structural threats, and the map expanded from burrows to bridges. A Supe with kinetic discharge had taken a position near a commuter span and begun testing the supports with pulses that left hairline fractures where there had been none, and the responding patrol was still en route from a brand activation. The liaison's voice asked whether Gojo could disengage without escalating the optics of abandonment, and Gojo asked whether the bridge would wait for a statement. Homelander said he would handle it, and the offer was less generous than it sounded. They left at the same time, one in a streak designed for headlines and the other in a motion that refused to disturb the air any more than necessary, and the cameras chose the one they understood. The bridge was already closed by the time they arrived, but the traffic that had not yet believed the closure formed a line of trapped decisions that would become casualties if the next pulse landed cleanly. The attacker turned toward the sound of flight and grinned, because this was the kind of stage that made careers, and the first discharge buckled a rail in a way that would not survive another. Gojo stepped onto the span and felt the structure complain beneath him, while Homelander hovered at eye level with a confidence that had rarely been contradicted in public. The injunction would be decided in minutes, but the bridge would be decided now, and the next pulse was already building as the wind shifted. The bridge had been engineered to distribute stress in ways that assumed accidents rather than demonstrations, and the first two pulses had already introduced a new variable into calculations that did not include intent. Traffic had been halted at both ends, but a line of vehicles remained stranded on the span where drivers had hesitated between instructions and instinct, and the attacker's grin widened as the third charge gathered in his palms with a hum that set the suspension cables singing. Homelander floated forward to meet the threat with a posture that had solved problems before, while Gojo stepped onto the asphalt and felt the vibration of a structure that was deciding whether it would continue to be a bridge. The liaison's voice in his ear began a sentence about federal liability and stopped when the next pulse snapped a guardrail into the river below. The discharge that followed did not explode so much as push, a concussive wave that traveled through steel like a rumor and returned as a shudder that bent the roadway a degree too far for comfort. Infinity refused the force where Gojo stood, turning the air in front of him into a boundary that made the wave part and flow around the space he occupied. But the bridge beyond his reach accepted the hit and answered with a groan that carried all the way to the stalled cars. Homelander closed the distance with a speed that blurred into intention, and his first strike drove the attacker back a step that would have ended most fights if the fight had been the point. The kinetic Supe laughed, because he did not need to win to do damage, and the next charge formed not at Homelander's chest but beneath his feet. Gojo moved without announcing the decision, because the span did not have time for a debate about optics, and the pressure of blue gathered along the attacker's stance with a precision that drew the man's footing toward a point that did not exist. The asphalt puckered in a shallow depression that stopped short of fracture, and the next pulse misfired into the empty space where his balance had been a moment before. Homelander's eyes tracked the correction with a flicker that did not reach the cameras, and for the first time since the day began, he adjusted his approach to accommodate someone else's method. The civilians in the trapped vehicles felt the roadway settle a fraction and did not know why. At the command center, a general who had not been invited to the injunction hearing asked whether the National Guard should be staged in case of structural failure, and the question moved through channels that preferred to pretend this was still a public safety matter rather than an operational one. The answer came back as a recommendation to prepare assets without deploying them, which satisfied no one and bought a minute that the bridge might not have. A separate request from the Department of Transportation asked for confirmation that the regulator would avoid techniques likely to cause torsional stress, and the liaison repeated the question to Gojo as if the words could influence gravity. He replied that he would avoid anything that endangered the people on the span, which was not the same promise but would have to do. Inside Vought Tower, Ashley watched the live feed with the sound off while legal updated her on the hearing's trajectory, and the phrase, "temporary restraining order," appeared on a monitor like a weather warning for a different city. The memo authorizing autonomous engagement had already been circulated, and Homelander's presence on the bridge provided the partnership optics they needed if the regulator made a visible mistake. A strategist suggested cutting to a split screen with a hospital fundraiser to soften the image, and Ashley nodded because the market disliked uncertainty even when it demanded spectacle. The stock ticker did not pause to ask who was safer. On the span, the attacker tried a different angle and discharged toward the suspension tower, betting that Homelander would prioritize interception over restraint, and the beam struck steel with a sound that traveled through bone. Gojo raised his hand, and the pull of blue took hold again, not to crush but to redirect, drawing the man's center toward a vector that would spend the force against itself rather than the bridge. The correction left the tower intact and the attacker on his knees, but the effort translated into a ripple that set a line of stalled cars rocking in sequence. A child began to cry in the back seat of a sedan that had nowhere to go. Homelander landed beside the kneeling man with a finality that suggested custody, and he asked whether federal regulators now issued arrests in the field. Gojo said that he issued safety, and the difference settled between them with the weight of a third party that would not be ignored. The restraints arrived seconds later in hands that had learned to move when told, and the attacker's laugh faded into a complaint that would be processed by someone who understood paperwork better than pain. The injunction ruling arrived as the cuffs clicked, granting Vought temporary relief in the form of coordination requirements that would make Gojo's next intervention a matter of permission rather than presence. The liaison relayed the terms with an apology that sounded like policy, and the general at the command center authorized the quiet staging of assets that would never be acknowledged if they were not needed. Somewhere beyond the river, another alert began to form in a place where bridges were not the only things that could fail, and the map expanded again as the wind shifted toward the harbor. The harbor alert did not begin with a blast but with a silence, because the first indication that something had gone wrong was the sudden absence of scheduled traffic in a shipping lane that did not tolerate improvisation. A privately contracted cargo vessel had drifted off its assigned vector, and then stopped entirely, as if the water had found a hand to hold it in place, and the dock cameras showed a figure on the forward deck, whose gestures turned the surface into a field of standing waves. The Coast Guard's first response assumed mechanical failure, until a tug attempting to assist found itself pinned in a current that moved without wind, and the harbor master's call for a temporary closure arrived just as the fourth ferry reported difficulty maintaining heading. By the time the liaison connected the feed to Gojo's tablet, the injunction's coordination requirement had already begun to matter in ways the bridge had not prepared them for. Vought's maritime response team acknowledged the incident with a promise to deploy within the hour, because their nearest asset had been scheduled for a publicity tour upriver, and the phrase, "in the interest of safety," appeared again in a message that meant wait. The federal attorney on the coordination line reminded everyone that unilateral intervention would risk contempt, which would risk funding, which would risk the next intervention in a way that did not help the ferries now drifting toward each other in a narrowing lane. Gojo listened to the argument and asked whether the injunction applied to tides, and when no one laughed, he stepped toward the waterline where a crowd had begun to gather without understanding why. Infinity kept the salt spray from finding him, as the first standing wave slapped against a pier hard enough to rattle teeth. The figure on the cargo vessel lifted both arms, and the harbor answered with a heave that pushed a moored tanker against its fenders, and the sound traveled through the dock pilings like a warning that arrived too late. A ferry's captain reported loss of rudder response as the current reversed beneath him, and the collision that followed would have been slow enough to film if it had not threatened to pin 200 people between hulls. The federal unit requested permission from Vought to proceed under emergency doctrine, and the reply came back as a request for joint visibility that would take minutes to arrange. Gojo asked the captain over an open channel to hold position, and received a laugh that did not reach the end of the sentence. He stepped onto the water without ceremony because ceremony would have required a platform, and the surface refused him in the same way it refused everything else, a boundary drawn not by force but by absence. The next heave tried to rise beneath his feet and found nothing to lift, and the standing wave broke around him in a pattern that made the cameras hesitate before deciding what they were seeing. Blue gathered along the vessel's bow where the figure stood, a pressure that did not crush but insisted, drawing the man's center of balance toward a point that would not allow another gesture to finish. The harbor's motion stuttered as the control faltered, and the ferry's captain felt the rudder answer for the first time in 30 seconds that had lasted a year. On shore, Butcher watched the live feed with a frown that suggested admiration would be a mistake, and Mother's Milk counted the distance between hulls with a habit he could not turn off. Frenchie pointed out that no brand could spin this as intimidation without insulting the people on that ferry, and Huey wondered aloud whether the injunction would matter if the alternative was a headline about mass drowning. In Vought Tower, Ashley's team prepared a statement about partnership that would arrive after the fact, and the legal department began drafting a contempt response just in case. The figure on the deck tried one last time to pull the water into a wall, and the attempt died as the pull of blue tightened into a correction that set him on his knees without setting the ship adrift. Gojo did not use red because the harbor would remember the recoil, and the consequences would not end with the incident, so the restraint remained a matter of position rather than impact. The federal unit moved in by launch with cuffs that would rust if they stayed long enough, and the vessel's engines coughed back to life as the current surrendered its borrowed intent. The injunction would be argued again in the morning, but the harbor would not forget tonight, and the staging order for National Guard engineers moved from quiet to ready, as reports of compromised piers began to arrive from the east side. Above the water, a familiar streak changed course once more, and the wind carried a tone that meant the next problem would not be contained by a shoreline. By nightfall, the injunction had begun to function less like a legal boundary and more like a dare, because every successful intervention Gojo completed without Vought's choreography translated into a segment questioning why the public had ever needed the choreography at all. The partnership statements released after the harbor incident landed with a softness that markets recognized as uncertainty, and the phrase "federal regulator" started appearing beside "national hero" in a way that made brand managers reach for water. Homelander watched the compilations in a room that had been designed for admiration and found himself measuring silence where applause should have been. Because the absence of collateral had become a critique, he could not answer with a smile. When the next briefing invited him to discuss coordination protocols with someone who did not wear a cape, the invitation read like an audit rather than a collaboration. At the Federal Coordination Center, a draft oversight plan circulated that would formalize Gojo's presence at major Supes responses regardless of corporate contract, and the language attempted to split the difference between authority and optics by describing him as a stabilizing adjunct. The distinction satisfied no one who had to stand next to him on a live feed, and Vought's counterproposal suggested that adjuncts should observe rather than engage unless invited by a contracted team lead. The invitation clause would have turned emergencies into etiquette, and the liaison summarized it for Gojo with a tone that suggested apology had become a job requirement. He asked whether invitations were issued before or after civilians were injured, and the silence that followed did not help the draft. The next incident arrived with a pattern that felt like intention, because a trio of mid-tier Supes began simultaneous community patrols in neighborhoods that had not requested them, and the live streams turned confrontations into content before anyone could agree on jurisdiction. A bystander argument in Harlem escalated when a patrol lead attempted a restraint that played better in rehearsals, and the man on the receiving end discovered a strength that had never been disclosed to his sponsor. The first throw took out a storefront that had been open for 12 minutes, and the second found a parked car with the kind of precision that lawsuits remember. Vought's nearest team acknowledged the call and asked for federal observation rather than intervention, and the request arrived as the third throw lifted a traffic light free of its base. Gojo arrived to find Starlight already directing a perimeter that had begun to fray, and she asked him to hold while her team attempted de-escalation in a tone that suggested she knew what he would say. The patrol lead mistook the pause for permission and lunged again, and the man's response buckled the pavement in a way that would not support another attempt. Infinity turned the next impact into a problem for physics rather than flesh, and the attacker's fist stopped short of a consequence he did not understand. Blue gathered along the vector of his movement and drew him into a stance that would not allow a follow-through, and the correction set him down against a curb that did not deserve the dent it received. Cameras caught the moment Starlight stepped between them and announced that the situation was under joint control, and the phrasing would trend within minutes as evidence of partnership that did not feel like one. The federal unit moved in with restraints while Vought's media team prepared a clip that emphasized her presence, and the crowd's applause divided itself along lines that would not appear on any map. A man in the back asked whether the government would be there next time, and the question reached a microphone before it reached an answer. Inside Vought Tower, Ashley's strategy meeting abandoned euphemisms and named the fear that had been circulating since Midtown, because replacement did not require a firing to be real. The proposal on the table authorized Homelander to lead a series of high-visibility responses without federal participation, and the risk assessment noted that success would re-establish primacy while failure would at least be his. Legal suggested requesting federal stand-downs in select zones to test public tolerance for unilateral action, and the phrase parallel authority entered the minutes with a weight that made everyone sit straighter. Butcher watched the Harlem feed with a look that suggested a new kind of problem, and Mother's Milk noted that the crowd had stopped chanting for brands and started chanting for safety. Huey wondered whether a man who could not be hurt would eventually be told where he could stand, and Frenchie replied that the telling would be the interesting part. On another screen, Homelander descended into a different neighborhood without a call for coordination, and the live banner described it as decisive leadership. The liaison's tablet lit with a request for Gojo to observe rather than engage in the next zone, and he asked whether observation stopped cars from being thrown through windows. The answer arrived as another alert from 3 blocks away, and the map's color shifted toward a shade that meant the night would not end where it had begun. By the second night, the injunction had evolved from a courtroom victory into an operational weapon, because Vought's request for federal stand-downs in select zones arrived wrapped in language about community confidence that would be difficult to refuse without sounding like occupation. The pilot program designated 3 districts for corporate-led response with federal observation only, and the coordination center signed off under pressure that did not appear on any memo. Gojo was asked to attend as a stabilizing presence who would not intervene unless invited by a contracted lead, and the phrasing landed like a leash someone hoped he would mistake for a ribbon. He asked whether the invitation would arrive before or after the first window broke, and the liaison replied that it would arrive as soon as legally practicable. Homelander chose the first zone himself because visibility mattered more than geography, and his arrival was choreographed to read as reassurance rather than rivalry, even as the live banners compared response times. The incident began as a noise complaint that found a camera before it found a resolution, and the man at the center discovered a capacity for kinetic discharge that had never been stress-tested outside a brand event. The first pulse took out a bus shelter that had not been warned, and the responding patrol hesitated between containment and coverage, while the crowd discovered a new direction to run. Gojo stood at the edge of the perimeter, with Infinity turning stray debris into an inconvenience, and the absence of his engagement became the story within minutes. Starlight's team attempted de-escalation with the language of partnership, and the attacker answered with a second discharge that rippled storefront glass down the block in a wave that would be counted later. Homelander moved in with a speed designed to end questions, and the first exchange lifted the man off his feet without lifting the tension from the air. The third pulse was aimed past him toward a line of parked cars where a mother was struggling with a car seat, and Gojo stepped forward without waiting for the invitation that arrived a second too late. The boundary that Infinity drew made the wave divide and spend itself against nothing, and the correction that followed with blue took the attacker's balance rather than his breath. The applause that came was immediate and divided, because the save did not fit the pilot program's script, and the commentators began asking whether federal observation had prevented corporate action or vice versa. Homelander's smile held for the cameras and slipped when they looked elsewhere, and the question of who had actually stopped the damage settled into a silence that would not trend. The federal unit moved in with restraints while Vought's media team prepared a statement about collaborative success that would not mention invitations. In the second zone, a scheduled patrol escalated into a pursuit when a bystander confrontation turned into a rooftop chase, and the junior hero from Harlem misjudged a landing that sent a HVAC unit into a stairwell where residents had been told to shelter. The request for federal intervention was drafted and then redrafted to satisfy the stand-down, and the delay translated into a fire that found its way through insulation not rated for intent. Gojo arrived to observe and found himself counting the floors where the smoke had already reached, and the invitation arrived as a push notification while the alarms failed. He did not read it before stepping inside. Butcher watched the split feeds from the van and noted that resistance did not require a weapon if it could be framed as policy, and Mother's Milk counted the seconds between the alarm and the entry with a habit that did not forgive paperwork. Frenchie wondered whether the stand-down would survive the first casualty, and Huey asked whether anyone would admit which rule had caused it. On a third screen, Homelander completed a high-visibility restraint in the first zone and turned to the camera with a line about safety that did not travel as far as he expected. Inside the stairwell, Infinity turned heat into distance and falling fixtures into background noise, and the pressure of Blue gathered along a jammed door that did not want to open without bringing the wall with it. The correction pulled the obstruction free without inviting a collapse, and the first family stumbled into a corridor that had not yet decided to burn. Outside, the stand-down's language was already being revised by someone who had not been there, and the market would open in 6 hours with a new question about authority. The third zone's alert arrived as the second family reached the street, and this time it was for a transit hub where the crowd would not be able to run even if they wanted to. The pilot program had promised clarity, but the night had delivered a different kind of test, and the next invitation would have to move faster than smoke. The transit hub had been designed for flow rather than flight, which meant the first sign of panic arrived as a hesitation that turned into a bottleneck before anyone could name the threat. A mid-tier Supe with vibrational discharge had taken a position near the platform's support columns and begun testing the concrete with pulses that felt like distant thunder until they didn't, and the overhead signage trembled with every attempt to keep time. The responding patrol was still outside negotiating camera angles when the first fracture appeared along a load-bearing seam, and the announcement system continued to apologize for delays in a voice that had not been trained for fear. The stand-down request arrived as Gojo reached the entrance, and the invitation followed a heartbeat later with language about joint leadership that did not change the math. Inside, Starlight tried to move the crowd toward an exit that had already become a rumor, and the second pulse buckled a section of platform that sent a line of commuters to their knees. Infinity turned the spray of concrete into a problem for janitorial staff rather than surgeons, but the column beyond his reach accepted the hit and answered with a crack that traveled into the ceiling. Gojo asked the attacker to stop and received a laugh that did not finish before Blue gathered along the man's stance, drawing his center into a correction that denied the next discharge. The crowd felt the difference as a lull that would not last. Homelander arrived through the roof with a certainty that did not ask for permission, and the landing scattered dust in a way that cameras would later describe as decisive. He offered to take over with a tone that made leadership sound like ownership, and the exchange that followed would be clipped before anyone heard the words. The attacker's third pulse was aimed at the far column, where the ceiling met a bank of lights, and the impact set a seam that had not been meant to open. Gojo moved to redirect with Blue, and felt the structure complain in a language that did not translate to policy. The correction held the attacker but translated into a torsion the column could not forgive, and the first panel of the ceiling came down in a cascade that turned a platform into a choice between exits. Infinity stopped what it could where he stood, but the span between supports accepted the rest, and a section of mezzanine gave way above a staircase that had been filling with people. Starlight shouted for space that did not exist, and the federal unit moved toward a gap that was already closing. The cost of control arrived not as a failure of power, but as a failure of time. Butcher watched the live feed and did not speak as the first casualty count began to climb, and Mother's Milk put a hand on the dashboard as if it could feel the structure through the screen. Huey asked whether the stand-down would be mentioned in the report, and Frenchie said reports did not like to name rules that killed. Inside Vought Tower, Ashley's team prepared a statement about unforeseen structural weakness, while legal revised the injunction strategy to account for federal initiative. Homelander lifted a slab with a strength that would save 2 and endanger 3, and the calculus would be debated later by people who had not been there. Gojo shifted the load where he could without inviting a second collapse, and the pull of blue became a thread he could not afford to break. The attacker's laugh had stopped when the restraints closed, but the ceiling had not heard them click. Outside, the first ambulance siren found the street as the map updated with a casualty figure that would not return to zero, and the injunction's language began to look like an artifact from a different night. The next alert arrived before the dust had settled, and this time it was not a burrow but a grid. The grid alert did not describe a single location, but a coordinated loss of stability across substations that fed 3 burrows, and the first outage arrived as a flicker that made elevators hesitate before committing to darkness. Backup generators came online in hospitals that had rehearsed for storms rather than sabotage, and traffic lights defaulted to confusion in intersections that had never learned to share. A Supe with electromagnetic manipulation had taken position along a maintenance corridor beneath a switching yard, and the responding patrol was still navigating access protocols when the first transformer failed with a sound that carried through concrete. The Coordination Center requested Vought leadership under the injunction's joint clause, and the delay translated into a block that would not breathe for another minute. Gojo entered the corridor with Infinity turning arcing sparks into a private inconvenience, and the heat that would have burned through a man's sleeve found nothing to hold onto where he stood. The attacker's field distorted tools and phones into liabilities, and the second transformer began to hum in a way that suggested an answer no one wanted to hear. Blue gathered along the man's stance and pulled his footing toward a vector that would deny the next surge, but the grid beyond them accepted the strain and answered with a cascading trip that rolled through a hospital wing already running on reserve. The liaison's voice asked for restraint in a tone that had learned what the word could cost. Homelander arrived by tearing a service hatch that would not be repaired this year, and the confidence in his posture did not account for the way fields refused to respect strength. He offered to remove the attacker from the environment entirely, and the suggestion would have been simpler if the environment were not threaded through a city that would remember the recoil. Gojo asked for 10 seconds and did not wait for agreement, because the transformer's pitch had climbed past safe. The correction with Blue tightened into a hold that denied the next discharge, but the load redistributed into a bus that fed a neonatal ward 3 miles away. Starlight's team reported flickers on their end as incubators transferred to manual oversight, and the backup that should have carried the minute stuttered with a complaint no one could fix from a corridor. The federal attorney on the line began a sentence about coordinated response and stopped when the ward's lights failed for the first time that night. Infinity kept the arc from finding Gojo's skin, but it could not keep the city from feeling the interruption. The cost arrived as a silence that would not trend. Butcher watched the outage map spread like a stain and asked whether the stand-down would be mentioned when the power came back, and Mother's Milk said the power would come back, but the minute would not. Huey wondered if anyone would connect the injunction to the delay, and Frenchie said the connection would depend on who owned the cameras. In Vought Tower, Ashley approved a live address about resilience while legal prepared language that described federal initiative as contributory. Gojo shifted his stance and chose not to use red because the recoil would not respect a neonatal ward, and the hold became a matter of patience rather than force. The restraints arrived through a hatch that would never sit right again, and the field collapsed with a sound that did not make headlines. The grid began to answer with a stuttering return that left some streets dark and others blinking, and the map's color changed in a way that would not be reversed by dawn. Outside, the first protest had already gathered beneath a building that had not been powered for hours, and the chant did not mention brands. The next alert arrived as a cluster over the river where the substations met the intake, and this time the request was not for coordination but for command. The intake cluster sat where the river met the city's promise to itself, a series of reinforced structures that turned current into continuity and assumed that emergencies would arrive one at a time. The first report described unauthorized access beneath the eastern station, and the second corrected it to multiple Supes with complementary capabilities that had never appeared together on a roster. By the time the third call confirmed structural tampering along the intake gates, the Coordination Center had stopped asking for Vought leadership and begun using the word command without quotation marks. The injunction's language did not survive the realization that if the gates failed, 500,000 people would discover what running water meant only after it was gone. Gojo reached the maintenance deck to find Starlight's team already attempting to hold a perimeter that had been designed to keep out weather rather than intent, and the first surge of displaced current hammered the grates with a force that had not been scheduled. One of the attackers lifted a hand, and the water answered with a column that tested the intake's tolerance for surprise, while another began a low-frequency discharge that set the support braces humming in a way that engineers would recognize as prelude. Infinity turned the spray into a private inconvenience where he stood, but the gates beyond his reach shuddered with a complaint that would not wait for coordination. Blue gathered along the stance of the nearest Supe and pulled him off the line of sight that had threatened a release. Homelander arrived with a descent that scattered tools into the dark, and for once he did not speak for the cameras because there were none that mattered down here. He moved to intercept the second attacker with a strike that would have ended most fights, and the impact translated into a vibration that traveled through the intake frame with a speed that made Starlight swear. The braces answered with a crack that would not unmake itself, and the water beyond the gates pushed as if it had been invited. The calculus shifted from restraint to survival in a breath that no one had time to mark. The federal unit requested evacuation of the adjacent districts, while engineers began to calculate how long the structure would hold under harmonic stress, and the answer came back as a number that would not make it to the top of the hour. Gojo asked Homelander to disengage from the frame and received a look that had learned what replacement felt like. The third attacker stepped into the gap and drove a kinetic pulse into the base of a gate, and the hinge answered with a scream that would not trend but would be heard in court. Infinity kept the shrapnel from finding skin, but it could not keep the river from finding an angle. Butcher watched the intake feed with a stillness that had replaced anger, and Mother's Milk counted the distance from the nearest school to the floodplain with a habit that had become a prayer. Huey asked whether this was where the rules ended, and Frenchie said the rules had ended at the bridge. In Vought Tower, Ashley's live address faltered when the outage map updated with a new color along the river, and legal began to draft language about unforeseeable convergence. Gojo felt the structure tip toward a future that would not be reversible, and the hold he had maintained all night began to look like a luxury the intake could not afford. He warned the unit to clear the deck and asked Starlight to move her team to the upper access, and the request carried a weight that did not require explanation. The water pressed against the compromised hinge with a patience that would outlast speeches, and the attacker's coordination suggested rehearsal rather than chaos. The gates bowed another inch as the harmonic discharge climbed, and the city beyond the river did not know it was already part of the calculation. The next decision would not be about optics, and the consequences were already in motion. By the time the first upper district sirens began to wail, the intake's compromised hinge had already decided that it would not survive another clean pulse, and the engineers on the line had stopped using phrases like mitigation in favor of terms that measured loss. The attackers moved with a coordination that suggested a brief had been issued somewhere beyond contracts, and the low-frequency discharge climbed into a range that turned steel into a tuning fork for catastrophe. Starlight's team cleared the upper access with a discipline that had not been sponsored, and the federal unit pulled back to a distance that would not matter if the gates let go. Gojo stood at the deck, where the river's patience met the city's need, and understood that the injunction would not be cited in the morning's reports. He did not announce the escalation because announcements belonged to rooms with microphones, and the intake had only the sound of water testing its arguments. Infinity held the spray at bay, while he stepped into a position that would not forgive hesitation, and the pull of blue gathered along the attacker's stance with a precision that denied their next gesture without inviting recoil. Homelander moved to intercept again and found his strike translating into a vibration the braces could not afford, and the look he gave Gojo this time was not for cameras but for confirmation. The hinge screamed as another pulse landed, and the number the engineers had whispered dropped again. Unlimited void was not a technique for arrests, and it had never been meant for infrastructure, but the intake did not care about intent, and the city beyond it did not care about doctrine. Gojo warned the deck once more and expanded a space that was not a place, and for a breath the attackers found themselves inside an infinity of information that denied the completion of motion. The discharge stopped because the mind that would have commanded it could not finish a thought, and the harmonic that had been climbing fell into a silence that did not forgive delay. The water pressed and found no new angle. The gate held through the first second that would have broken it, and the braces settled into a future that included repair rather than replacement. But the deck did not escape the cost of a decision made too late. A support along the maintenance span failed where the vibration had already done its work, and a section of access collapsed into the dark with a sound that would not be recorded. The federal unit counted heads and came up short, and the casualty list would include names that had not been on any contract. The city kept its water and lost something it could not invoice. Above ground, the protests that had begun as questions became demands that did not mention brands, and the morning's headlines would carry a phrase about federal command that could not be walked back into partnership. Vought's address shifted from resilience to cooperation, in a tone that acknowledged a hierarchy without nomming it, and the injunction's language began to look like an artifact from a night the intake had outlived. Homelander stood on the upper access and watched the river as if it had chosen someone else, and the cameras that arrived later would not capture the moment he did not speak. In the weeks that followed, the oversight plan became statute, and the stabilizing adjunct was written into law with an authority that did not ask for invitations. Gojo attended the briefings with the same casual detachment that had greeted the assignment, cooperating where civilians were concerned, and ignoring the parts that pretended harm could be scheduled. Vought reframed its heroes as partners in a regulated ecosystem and filed challenges that would take years, and the market learned a new definition of safety that did not trend. The boys watched the first federalized response roll out without sponsor banners and understood that distrust would have to find a new target. The world did not return to normal because normal had relied on contracts that no longer held, and the city learned to read sirens as directives rather than promotions. Somewhere along the river, a repaired hinge carried a scar that would not be painted over, and the man assigned to regulate Supes continued to protect civilians with a boredom that never extended to their lives. The intake held, the statute passed, and the line between heroism and authority moved to a place that would not move back.